the class is actually you make your major is about the international business. So please bear with me for the next maybe 1.5 hours, which is mainly focused on politics, some legal aspect, and also lots of military things. So that would be very great if after that, if after the talk, if you have any comments, feedbacks, and of lots of questions, that would be very great. But before beginning, I would like to have a disclaimer to make. That is, the views throughout this talk and expressed here are all those my personal viewpoint, and they do not definitely reflect the official policy of the Vietnamese government or the viewpoint of the place that I'm now working for is the Institute for Chinese Studies at Vietnam Academy of Social Sciences. So the first question is why I'm interested in this topic in the first place. Well, okay. So when we talk about the South China Sea, what people often think of is this one. Is this thing, okay? So this portion of water is South China Sea. And when we talk about the South China Sea disputes, there's a lot of countries and parties. There's a dispute over the Paracel Islands. You can see the first circle up here. The Paracel Islands is the dispute claimed by both Vietnam and Republic of China. So from now on, I will use a short term of China to refer to the PRC. So Paracel is claimed both by Vietnam and China, but it is actually at the moment occupied by China after 1974. The second dispute is about the Scarborough Shoal. That is among two countries, one party, China, the Philippines, and Taiwan. And the third dispute is over the Spratly Islands. That is 5 countries and 6 parties. That's how in Vietnam we use it to identify all the actors claiming or the claimant in the Spratly Islands. So we have China, Vietnam, Malaysia, Brunei, the Philippines, and one party is Taiwan. So they claimed over the Spratly Islands. So, but the dispute here is rather complicated because they involve the claim on sovereignty and the jurisdiction of these countries in these 3 locations. That is how people think about the South China Sea dispute. But there's actually exists another dispute. That is the dispute between the US and China over the issue of freedom of navigation. So that's why often you hear the news about like the US destroyer, the naval ships running around the South China Sea, and then there's a war of word between China and the US afterward. So why that thing happened? So it raised questions to me, what actually the nature of that dispute between the US and China over the issue of freedom of navigation, especially in the context of a growing strategic competition between the 2 powers in the region. So in this talk, what I'm trying, I will try my best to provide you an understanding, or more precisely is my understanding of the dispute between the US and China over the issue of freedom of navigation in the South China Sea, and will provide you the aspect or the legal, the political, and the military aspect of this dispute. And then I will introduce to you also the Vietnamese approach and policy to this issue. So then, in the next maybe more than 1 hours, then we will proceed our talk in 5 parts. So the first part, because I'm not so sure how really familiar all of you that, but now I know you are focused on international business. So the first part is important then. So in this part, then I will give you some definition or at least some general views of some key terms which I will use throughout my talk. The second thing that is good for you because it's all the legal stuff. It's about the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea and all the relevant provision in the UN clause which is related to freedom of navigation. The third part that I will focus early on the US position and approach to the freedom of navigations and all the operations that the US conducted in the South China Sea. The first part that I will focus on the China approach to this issue. The fifth part is try to introduce you some uh, angles about the Vietnamese approach. And then I will conclude my talk with some remarks. So then, let's start with some keywords then. The first one is South China Sea. So we get back to the second slide. So I told you that this portion of water called the South China Sea, but because it's in the east of Vietnam, so Vietnam called it the East Sea. But it's in the west of the Philippines, so the Philippines name it the West Philippine Sea. But throughout my talk, then I will use South China Sea to refer to this portion of water. Okay, so the second one is UN Clause 1982. So UN Clause is a abbreviation for the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. So basically, it's an international agreement that defines the rights as well as the responsibilities of nations with respect to their use of the world's oceans. So, like in one country, the highest or the supreme law or the highest legal documents of one country, what is it according to you? It's constitution. So the constitution for one country is the highest legal document, right? And for some people, they called the UN clause actually a constitution for the oceans. And this constitution was adopted in 1962 after a lot of negotiation between the coastal state and some big power on maritime power. And they came into force in 1994. Right. So this because according to the if you base on the UN clause, then you can divide what is your rights and what's your responsibilities. But in any specific zone at sea, how you know what is your rights and what is responsibilities? So what we need is a baseline, right? A baseline. So the baseline is actually, you can understand it, is a low water line along the coast of a coastal state. So in this diagram, then I highlight it with the red lines over here. You can see it on your your left hand side. So this red line, if it is the continental state, which means that they have the land, the real land on the a continent like Vietnam, China, for instance. So they are continental state. And what they need to use is the normal baseline. That's the line on your left-hand side. And this baseline lies where the water retreats at low water. But in some cases, for instance, Indonesia actually is an archipelagic state, which is the country comprised entirely of islands. So in this case, they will not use normal bases. but the international law allows them to use what we call the straight lines, the straight baseline. And you can see that on the small diagram on your right hand side. So they use the straight baseline to draw around the island group. So which means then there are two kinds of baseline. One is normal baseline and the other is straight baseline. And from this baseline, we can measure the different, what we call maritime zones. So in this talk, I use two main maritime zones. One is territorial sea and the other is exclusive economic zone. So back you see your diagram on the right hand side, the big one, at the left hand side, the big one. The territorial sea is the zone extending 12 nautical miles from the baseline. So this is the zone. I do not know if you can see the point, but then yes, it's the you can see the word is territorial sea and it is 12 nautical miles measured from the red line, the baseline. And then the exclusive economic zone is the area beyond and adjacent to the territorial sea, and we measure it is 200 nautical miles from the baseline. So the big one, a very big one. Besides the different maritime zone, according to the UN clause, we also have three kinds of maritime features. So you can see here is different maritime features. The first one is the islands. So the islands is normally a naturally formed area of land surrounded by water. The important thing is they always above the water, and they are capable of sustained economic activities and human habitation. So you can see here there must be electric cities, all kind of like shopping mall, everything there, but it must sustain the human habitation there. The second maritime features is rock. So rock is basically like the island in the sense that it also the naturally formed area of land surrounded by water. And they are always above the water. But the different thing is early bird, you can see the lonely bird there. Early bird can live in the rocks because if it is rocks, it cannot sustain human habitation. So that is the only thing is different from the island. The third maritime features is that sometimes birds can stand, but sometimes birds can't, because the third type is low tide elevations, which means that they only above the water at low tide, but when the high tide, they will submerge. And that is the three maritime features we defined in the UN clause. So we go through nearly all the key terms. The main keyword of our presentation today is freedom of navigation. So what is the freedom of navigation? Basically, and put it simply, freedom of navigation is the right for a vessel to transit from point A to point B, and this transit without suffering any interference by other states. So you go straight, no one can do anything to interfere your transit from point A to point B. And freedom of navigation through the state practice is a customary right, and it was officially codified into the UN Clause 1982. So with all of that in mind, now we will move to our second part, in which I will try to provide you some relevant provision of UN clause which is related to freedom of navigation. And then I will show what is the differences between China and the US interpretation of those provisions regarding to the freedom of navigation. Right. So So the UN clause, the principle of freedom of navigation is not guaranteed by only one single provision or article, but it has been referred to in a series and a number of articles, and that create kind of a set of related understandings. But basically, the freedom of navigation in the UN clause mainly comprised of two things. One is innocent passage in the territorial sea, and the second one is free passage in the exclusive economic zone. So back to this diagram, when we talk about the territorial sea, the 12 nautical mile from the baseline. So this zone now generally is considered as the sovereign territory of a state. But according to the UN clause, ships of all countries enjoy the right of innocent passage through the territorial sea of other states. So I can give you some visual image so that you understand what is innocent passage. So you look at the diagram on your right hand side and the above one, the innocent passage. As long as the vessel, right, move directly through the territorial sea and refrain from any activities not necessary for their continuous and expeditious passage, they enjoy the right of innocence. So you see here, they go straight, no stop, just straightforward, that's fine. But if you have the behavior like the diagram below, you're running around and it's not straightforward, you may stop, and that is unlawful, it's illegal, and it is not innocent passage. Other activities can be considered as innocent. For instance, you threat or you use force against the sovereignty or the territorial integrity of the coastal state, and you exercise and practice with the weapons. Fishing activities also can be considered as innocent, or the survey or research activities also be considered as innocent too. Considered as not innocent too. The second one is related to the exclusive economic zone. So you hear from the name of the zone, exclusive economic zone, which means the coastal state, they have the sovereign right to explore and do whatever economic activities there. For instance, explore, conserve, manage the natural resources, whether it is living or not living like the fish and not living like all the oil and gas of the water adjacent to the seabed and of the seabed. And they also have the jurisdiction over the marine scientific research. However, according to the Convention on the Law of the Sea, they clearly stipulates that all countries, no matter you are the coastal or you are the landlocked, like Laos, for example, they all enjoy the freedoms of navigation and overflight in the EEZ of other countries. So if everything is that clear, whether there still exists the dispute between the US and China over the interpretation, you should bear in mind there's a fact that if it is international agreement, it is the result of negotiation and compromise. So in some issues, they will open for interpretation, or because it's the result of compromise. So sometimes they just silence and use the ambiguous so that they can reach the agreement. And the UN clause is no exception for that. There's some many others in issues that it's not clear in the UN clause. And the very first controversy between the US and the China over the innocent passage is that I summarize it here for you. So the first controversy is over the innocent passage. So the US, they argues that all ships, no differentiation of civilian or military ships all enjoy the right of innocent passage. And also due to the fact that the UN Clause, the Convention, does not have any article or provision to require the foreign warships to obtain the prior notification or permission. Therefore, there's no need for the foreign warship or military vessel to acquire such consent or notification when exercise the innocent passage in the territorial of other coastal state. But China, they argues that no, that's not the way it should be because military vessel and the merchant or the commercial vessel should be treated differently because they actually different in their nature. That's what China argue. And also due to the fact that the UN clause does not have they don't have any provision and they don't prohibit coastal state from requiring prior notification from the foreign ships, and that's why actually China codified its interpretation in the domestic laws of China and states that non-military means commercial foreign ships enjoy the right of innocent, but the foreign and military ships, excuse me, must obtain the permission from the government of the PRC when exercise the innocent passage. And the second controversy between the US and China is the military activities in the exclusive economic zone. So the two powers disagree sharply on whether the coastal state has the right under the international law to regulate the activities of foreign military vessels and activities operating within, in this case, China's exclusive economic zone. The US position is that because name exclusive economic zone, so the US position is that the UN clause truly gives the coastal state the right to regulate the economic activities within the exclusive zone, but they do not give the coastal state the right to regulate military activities, foreign military activities. But China argues that no, the UN clause gives the coastal state the right not only regulate the economic activities, but also the military activities. And that's why, according to the China, freedom of navigation and overflight in the EEZ should not include the freedom to conduct military and reconnaissance activities or intelligence gathering. According to the US, China, that is unlawful. And the interesting here is that because the UN clause, they do not expressly address which, if any, military activities may be conducted in the EEZ without the coastal state consent. So our question here now is how all of this controversy, all of that legal provision plays out in our region of South China Sea. So let's move to our next part. Is about the US position and the freedom of navigation operation in the South China Sea. In this part, then I will try to give you some view about the position held by the US and its program called the Freedom of Navigation Program. But the main duty of this part is I'm trying to answer three main questions. The first one is, what are the Chinese maritime claims that have been challenged by the US for freedom of navigation operations in the South China Sea? The second question is, why US need to challenge? I mean, according to the US, not for me, why, but why US think why they have to challenge those claims. And the third one is, how has US conducted for not to challenge those claims? So according to the US, actually US adopt a rather broad approach of the principle of freedom of navigation, which actually is put under a bigger principle of freedom of seas. And this is clearly defined by the U.S. Department of Defense. It is that is all of the rights, freedoms, and the lawful uses of the sea and airspace, including for military ships, aircraft, and guaranteed to all nations under the international law. And I mean, even before the UN clause came into force or signed in 1982, then in 1979, the US already initiated a program which they call Freedom of Navigation Program. And it is implemented to challenge what the US called excessive maritime claims. So these claims, according to the US, are unlawful because they are the unlawful attempts of the coastal state in order to restrict the rights and the freedom of navigation and overflights, as well as other lawful uses of the sea of other countries. And to implement the program of freedom of navigation, China actually used two tools, or actually it can be the two continuous subsequent steps. The first one is the part of the US Department of State. So it means the diplomacy way. So they will through the consultation and representations, and they contest diplomatically, send their protest diplomatically to the coastal state over their excessive maritime claims, and then turn to the part of the Department of Defense. After the diplomatic protest, the Department of Defense, they will deploy the naval and military forces and military asset to carry out the freedom of navigation operation. And shortly from now on, I will call this operation is FONOPS on the ground to challenge what they call excessive maritime claims. So what the FONOPS in South China Sea challenge, what Chinese maritime claims that the FONOPS challenge in the South China Sea. So every year, the Department of the State of the US, they will issue a report called Annual Report on FONOPS. And in 2021, the report, according to the 2021 report, the US officially challenges 4 maritime claims made by China in the South China Sea. I have a slide for it here. It's on your left-hand side. One is in East China Sea, but the 4 is in the South China Sea. I will go a little bit detail on each of these maritime claim by China because they will have the consequential implications for the U.S. interests in the South China Sea, which I will go into detail later on. So the very first claim by China that the U.S. challenge is related to the Strait baseline. Now, we back to the slide of the baseline, right? So as you see here, as I mentioned, only continental state that they can use the normal baseline. They have to use the normal baseline. And only archipelagic state, they use the straight line. That is put simply, but according to the UN clause, it's a little bit more complicated. But that is what you just need to know. So, but the thing is, in 1996, China draw the straight baseline around the Paracel Islands. And so you can see here, like on your right hand side, the above diagram, this what is China using in Paracel Island. So they draw the straight baseline around the Paracel. And the US argues that, well, international law does not permit the continental state like China to establish that baseline around the entire dispersed islands group. So that is what the US has to take conduct the follow-ups to challenge. The second maritime claim made by China being challenged is the criminalization of surveying and mapping activities by the foreign entities which do not obtain the approval from or cooperate with the PRC. Actually, this comes back to the dispute that we mentioned before, is whether a coastal state has the right to regulate the military activity, the foreign military activities within their exclusive economic zone. And the US argues that the coastal state's jurisdiction over marine scientific research, that's okay, but not extend that jurisdiction over the military survey or hydrographic surveys. But China, they does not distinguish between that two surveys. So the military surveys, according to China, actually also the marine scientific research. So they do not distinguish the two, and they argue that they still have the jurisdiction over the military activities in their exclusive economic zone. The third claims by China is the required prior permission for innocent passage of the foreign military ship. That is easy because we mentioned about the innocent passage, and China requires that every military ship need to get the prior notification, even the permission to exercise innocent passage. The fourth claim by China is the implied claims, which means that China hasn't had any domestic laws or regulation on this, but implied through the China's activities, actions, and statement. And it related to the low tide elevation. I'll get back to this slide. So we mentioned about the low tide elevation, which is that it's not all the way above the water, and it cannot sustain human habitation, right? The thing is, according to the UN clause, this kind of features, they will not subject to sovereignty of the coastal state, put it simply. And the thing is, regardless of their location, they do not generate any maritime zone of this own, which means this kind of features, they cannot have the territorial sea or the exclusive economic zone. But the thing that if we base on the China's actions and statement, it seems that China implies that they will have the claim of the territorial sea and the airspace around those features of low tide elevation, and that's the US think they need to challenge. Right. So all of that thing is the maritime claims made by China, and the US conduct the follow-ups to challenge. So the thing is, why US think they need to challenge? First, when you think about that, it seems a little bit like straightforward, but I try to make it like it's more complicated than that. And I will follow the three main interests of the US in China to explain why the US think that they need to challenge China's maritime claims in the South China Sea. The first one is actually the US really have the legal concern over China's maritime claims and the implication of that for international legal regime. But the ironic thing is the US actually is not a member of the UN class. So they up to now, they even haven't ratified the convention yet. But the US has consistently argued in favor of the UN clause law and follows the UN clause as the customary international law. So the US concerned that the minority position, like in this case, China's position, and China's interpretation of UN clause could gather enough momentum to bring about the establishment of a new law of the sea norms. And China's maritime claim, if gained the acceptance in the region of the South China Sea, it will have a broad implication for the world because international law is universal in application. You can imagine like this. If a coastal state say or insist that the foreign military activities in their exclusive economic zone are unlawful, and I, the user state, will abstain from engaging in any kind of that activities. So every countries and even myself maybe might conclude that is how one choose to interpret the Convention of Law of the Sea. And the FONOPS, the Freedom of Navigation Operation, are undertaking like to avoid that outcome. And actually, the US see its FONOPS as a legal exercise to reinforce the American interpretation of international maritime law. The second reason for US to do that is it really related to the strategic interests of the US in the South China Sea. And there are two aspects. The first one is that one of very principal interests of the US in the South China Sea is to get the access. But it's not that old kind of access. The thing is unhindered access to the water of South China Sea for the US naval and military vessels. And only by obtaining that unhindered access can the US sustain its ability to project the military powers, not just in its Asia, but all around the world. And for the US, this access to the South China Sea is and will faces threats mainly resulting from the China's maritime claims if they are not challenged. So I have a map here for you. You can see it here. So if China claimed on the jurisdiction that they have the right to regulate the military activities within their EEZ, plus the claim that the low tide elevation as well as some island group have their maritime zone like territorial zone and the exclusive economic zone. So you can see the diagram on your left hand side. All the blue and the green areas are all those the area that the US military cannot access. And if that applied to the whole world, then you can see all the blue light around the continental state here. This is a claimable world exclusive economic zone. It's also like the US will be military activities will get restricted. Another aspect related to military and strategic interests of the US is that by claiming to defend the rules-based order, and at the core of that order is freedom of navigation, conducting FONOPS, the US has been able to justify its continued military presence and its strengthened deterrence against China in the region. Last but not least is the reason for the US to challenge is that in a broader context of China's rise and strategic competition with the US, it involved greatly the geopolitical interest for China, for the US to maintain its commitment to partners and allies in the region. And the FONOPs actually are designed to send the signals of reassurance and commitment to the US allies and partners in the South China Sea. And by claiming defend the freedom of navigation and the rules-based order, then the US has been able to strengthen its allies and partner. And for the last 2 or 3 years, you see this, they also, under the flag of freedom of navigation, they bring about the efforts of other countries, which they called like-minded countries around the world, to join the US efforts in the South China Sea. Now, how the US will conduct those FONOPs, that will be less things for you to like really hard to digest in this part. Then I will focus on the FONOPs of the US in the period after 2050. So it's under like the 2 years, the 2 years, the final 2 years of Obama administration. So why in 2015? So first of all is I do not know if you have heard about that, but in 2012, sorry. So you see the Scarborough Shore here is next to the north of the Philippines. So actually China gained the control of Scarborough Shore. And from 2013 and 2015, China engaged crazily massive islands building activities in the South China Sea. And it turns out that in September 2015, at a hearing before the Senate of the US, the Department of State admitted that actually since 2012, there is no FONOP conducted within the 12 nautical miles of China's occupied land features in the Spratly Islands. And it led to a very public debate in the US is whether the US should soon resume its FONOPs in the South China Sea. And 1 month later, Obama administration decided to conduct the FONOPs after 3 years of interruption in the Spratly Islands. I can show you actually this one. So you can see it from your right hand side. You see the diagram with Subi Reef that actually illustrate the FONOPs by the FONOP conducted by the US. The very first one after 3 years conducted by the US in the South China Sea. And this one is very important because after 2015, the presence or absence of US FONOPs in the region really dominate the discussion about the China's problematic conduct in the South China Sea and became the parameter of American commitment and resolve in the region. And after that, then the Obama administration also conducted another 3 FONOPs. It's one in the July of 2016, one in May 2016, and another one, the last one of Obama administration is on October 2015. And the thing is, they took place not only in Spratly Islands, but also challenged the maritime claimed in the Spratly Island too. So here is the 2 diagram on your right hand side is illustrate the first and the second one, the FONOPs under Obama administration. So under Trump administration, Trump is interesting. So in 2018, the US National Defense Strategy labels under Trump administration. So they label China as a strategic competitor that seeks to displace the US and achieve hegemony in the Indo-Pacific region. So since then, the US has pursued a more robust program of freedom of navigation in the South China Sea. And I just want to make 3 points about the FONOPs under Trump administration. So here, I do not know if it is small enough. It's small, you can see it. Okay, I will make it little. But don't worry, you don't need to read all of that. What I want you to see from this one is that is a long list of FONOPs. And it shows that the number of FONOPs conducted under Trump administration rose sharply. So in 2019, 8 FONOPs conducted is twice as much as the whole FONOPs conducted under Obama administration, but only 1 year. And the US Secretary of Defense Mark Esper stated in 2019 that he stated that 2019 marked the greatest number of FONOPs in the South China Sea in the history of 40 years of the FONOPs program of the US. But the thing is, in 2020, this number even higher. So they reached 10 FONOPs, and total under Trump administration, they conduct 28 FONOPs in the South China Sea alone. The second point that I want to highlight here is about the manner in which the FONOPs is conducted. So before, each FONOPs often conducted by only one destroyer. But in 2018, the FONOPs conducted involve one cruiser and one destroyer. So you just imagine that the cruiser is really big naval ship. The destroyer is big too, but it's like next to the cruiser, it's a small one. So this operation is the very first time a single cruiser was deployed to perform such a mission. And according to some observers, it achieved a breakthrough in the US operational strength. And in 2019, there are 2 FONOPs, and each conducted by 2 destroyers. And that is very worth noting, because the US used 2 destroyers just to conduct 1 FONOPs, and that happened twice. So some observer argues that the US really had demonstrated its increasingly stringent position on the issue of freedom of navigation in the South China Sea. The last point on this is that, but despite all of that, under Trump and Obama administration, the US Navy, they did not issue any public statement or rarely provide details of those operations. The list that you see here with the location, the date, and the name of the warship, actually they are collected from very dispersed information from the media, but there is no public or the press statement officially from the US Navy on these FONOPs. But under Biden administration, now that changed. And there's 3 points I want to make here too. And I personally think that I would like to argue that it is actually the 3 fundamental change in the manner that the US conduct FONOPs under Biden administration. The very first one is that, different from Obama and Trump administration, the 7th Fleet, which is in charge of conducting the FONOPs, whenever there is a FONOP conducted, they will issue this thing. They will issue the specific press release, and they post on their official website of the 7th Fleet, and they clearly stated the time, the date, the claims that the US challenged, and even updated the US rejection of China's announcement very, very quick. You can see it on your left-hand side. The whole 2 first paragraph is what the US reject the China's announcement that the China chasing the US from their territorial sea after the FONOP. And it is like an attempt to help the US to take initiative in the propaganda war with China. The second thing about the FONOPs under Biden administration is that, so if you look, this is the list of all the FONOPs that Biden administration conduct up to now. So the latest one is in April, last April. If you look at this, there's one thing to note is every year around the date 12th of July, there will be a FONOP conducted. We will see that in this July. But then why its date? Why the 12th of July every year? Because the 12th July 2016 is the permanent court of arbitration they issued the South China Sea ruling, and in which the arbitration concludes that the China claim based on historical rights. Now we mentioned about one thing is 9-light. I do not have much time to explain about that, but basically China claimed the whole South China Sea based on their historic rights. And this is according to the South China Sea rulings of the arbitration that is invalid. And the US conduct FONOPs around exactly this time in order to first commemorate this South China Sea ruling. The second one is to show its support and commitment to the ruling despite China's rejection. Last point, and according to me, is the most important change in the US conduct of FONOPs is that actually Biden administration seems not place high level of importance to the FONOPs anymore in comparison with the Obama and Trump administration. And it seems that Biden administration believes that FONOP is not the early and the main activities to implement the US policy and serve the US interests in the South China Sea. Because you can see it's reflected in the fact that the US Navy has reduced the number and the frequency of freedom of navigation operation in the South China Sea in the past 2.5 years. So the Biden administration approach now is to the FONOPs now is that they will maintain a moderate number of FONOPs, just enough to convey the necessary political message to partners and allies in the region and still have the justification for their continued military presence. But they combine the FONOPs with other military activities with deterrent value in the context of increasingly strategic competition with China. That is whole stuff of what the US has done. China won't stand still? No. So what is China's approach to the freedom of navigation and their responses to the US FONOPs in the South China Sea? Then I will lead you to my fourth part of the talk. Is about the China's position and how China approached to the issue of freedom of navigation. So from what we learned so far, you might have quite a little bit of general view about the position held by China. Different from the US is not a member of UN clause, but China is an official party member of the UN clause since 1996. But before 1996, China already some elements of the freedom of navigation, for instance, the inertion through the territorial sea, or the freedom of navigation and overflight in China's EEZ, has been seen in some China's domestic laws. But actually, only relatively recently, China's policy on freedom of navigation has been officially articulated in some more details. So according to one Chinese statistical and research paper, the term freedom of navigation, 航行自由, in South China Sea appeared in China's official statement in 2010. That is when by that time, the Chinese Foreign Minister Yang Jiechi, he directly used the phrase freedom of navigation in the South China Sea to refute the US involvement in the region after the US Secretary of State by that time is Hillary Clinton affirms that US has the national interest in the South China Sea freedom of navigation. And in the period of 6 years from 2010 to 2016, this term has been used 36 times, and 4 out of which used by the Chinese leaders, and 40 times mentioned by the Foreign Ministry spokesperson. So, but the thing is, up to now, China does not have any clear or official definition of freedom of navigation. But the statements by the Chinese leaders and officials confirm the view from China that freedom of navigation in the South China Sea is not absolute freedom without restriction. So for instance, in 2015, The Chinese ambassador to the Philippines, Zhao Jianhua, when being asked why China shoo away the US Navy ship plane in the South China Sea, then he stated that we say freedom of navigation must be observed in accordance with international law, but no freedom of navigation for warships and airplanes. The same tone also be seen in 2018. Liu Xiaoming, he's the ambassador of China to the UK, and in one essay he wrote for The Guardian, he clearly stated that freedom of navigation is not an absolute freedom to sail at will. So China criticized and opposed the US freedom of navigation based on all of this position that China held. And the criticism and opposition against the FONOPs of the conduct by the US has you can go to the website of the China's foreign ministry. Then if you type there, then there's a list of the statement made by the foreign ministry spokesperson. But in 2020, it's I think that is quite comprehensive way of China's criticism to the US. So I quote it here for you. When they talk about they comment about the US FONOP in the South China Sea is that freedom of navigation in the South China Sea claimed by the US is nothing but the freedom of trespassing enjoyed by the US advanced military aircraft vessel and making provocations, and that the US is posing a grave threat and major risk to the region peace, stability under the pretext of freedom of navigation. So in fact, actually China is not the only country in the world held the position that the UN clause give the coastal state the right to regulate not only economic but also military activities. Actually, if I'm not mistaken, then there are more or less 80 countries in the world share the same position with China. But the thing is, only 3 of them, including China, North Korea, and Peru, they have directly interfered with the foreign military activities in their exclusive economic zone. And the dispute over whether China has the right under the UN clause to regulate the foreign military activities appear to be at the heart of incidents between the Chinese and US ships and aircraft. So lots of people often mention about some notable incident. For example, in March 2001, in September 2002, and there are 2 incidents in 2009, so in which the Chinese ships and aircraft confront and harass the US naval ships as they are conducting the survey and ocean surveillance operation in China's EEZ. And one of the most serious incidents happened in 2018 when one US destroyer conducting the FONOPs near the Javan Reef, that is maritime features occupied by China in Spratly Islands. So the one Chinese destroyer approached the US destroyer as close as only 45 yards and warned the US destroyer to change course. And I mean, that is very close between the 2 destroyers, 2 big ships. So you can imagine how serious it is. And the US Department called it is very, very unsafe and unprofessional maneuver of China. The thing is, why China has to protest? Is it clear to you why? But then I think that there are 3 ways to answer the questions of why China protests the US FONOPs. The first one is China really actually has the security concern because Hainan, we can come back to the first part. So this is Hainan, the one that up to the Paracel Islands, right? Hainan. So Hainan is part of South China Sea, where actually Chinese nuclear submarine base and the strategic space launching site of China's are actually all located in Hainan. And that is the need to prevent or even seize all of the US operation and overflight has become overwhelmingly important for Beijing in this sense. And the jurisdiction over the large portion of the South China Sea is now a matter, actually a real important matter of Chinese security, military expansion, power projection of China into the Pacific. The second reason is related to the legal and the control aspect is that based on its own interpretation of UN clause, China diplomatically protest and directly interfere with the US foreign military activity in their exclusive economic zone. The whole idea behind that is that over time, these maritime claims made by China will change from contention to largely a legally recognized claim under the customary international law, and the state's practice are just the right mean to do it. The third reason is that it relates to my third point here. The second is related, is that actually for China against the freedom of navigation operation by the US, deep down is to challenge the US-led maritime order. But the thing is, they does not want to change upside down the whole order because they still benefit from it, but they try to create a more favorable maritime order to serve well their interest. And the ultimate goal of China is to build a maritime power. And this is also reflected in another fact, and this is interesting because we all know that China challenge and protest the foreign military activities in their exclusive economic zone, as well as the incursion in the territorial sea. But actually, recent year, the PLA is the People's Liberation Army, is the China's army, is increasingly undertaking the very same type of military activities in other countries' exclusive economic zone. So I took these photos from a report of the US Department of Defense. All the dots that you can see here is the Chinese military activities in other countries' exclusive economic zone. For instance, in our regions, like in the East China Sea, in 2017, the Chinese Navy conducted air and naval operation in Japan's exclusive economic zone. And the Chinese survey ships are also extremely active in the South China Sea, and they frequently operate in the claimed exclusive economic zone of other countries in the regions, like the Philippines, Vietnam, and Malaysia. And at the time we are talking now, actually, some Chinese ships early this month too, the Chinese survey ships actually is running around and doing their survey in the in the exclusive economic zone claimed by Vietnam. And all of that, and Vietnam has made a very rare statement, order the China's survey has to leave the Vietnam's exclusive economic zone. I talk about Vietnam because right after that, then I will try to give you some view about the Vietnamese approach to the freedom of navigation. So how Vietnam see all of this thing happened just right in front of their east side of the country. So from the legal aspect, Vietnam is also a member of the UN clause, and it's in 1994. And in 2012, yes, Vietnam promulgated the national law of the sea. Actually, before Vietnam has this law, so before 2012, Vietnam also required the foreign military vessel to obtain the prior permission and prior notification when undertaking the Innocent Passage through Vietnam's territorial sea. But after 2012, then the requirement for prior permission has already been removed. But the military vessel that still need to make a prior notification when exercise Innocent Passage. But the thing is, if you look dig deep into all the Vietnamese current legislation, there is actually no detailed procedure on the penalty nor the sanction if those ships fail to make such kind of prior notification. So according to some Vietnamese scholars, they argue that actually the requirement on the prior notification in the case of Vietnam is only for facilitates the safety of navigation of those ships. So it does not hinder any freedom of navigation at all. The second thing is the military, the freedom of navigation or the military activities in the exclusive economic zone. Well, the law of the Sea of Vietnam and other laws and regulations in Vietnam have no express provision on this matter. However, in the law, there is one provision in which that they prohibit all acts threatening security, defense, and security of Vietnam. And maybe throughout this talk, I may give you a very a misleading understand that the U.S. FONOPS in the South China Sea is only to challenge the Chinese maritime claims, but it's not the case because I try to focus on the US and the China disputes. That's why I focus only on the Chinese maritime claims that challenged by the US. But actually the US FONOPS in the South China Sea conducted is also challenge the partners and the allies of China of the US. For instance, Vietnam and Taiwan is also be challenged by the US FONOPS. So the US FONOPS in the South China Sea challenge actually two maritime claims made by Vietnam. So you can see here, Taiwan is one maritime claim be challenged by the US, and Vietnam has two in 2020. So the first one is that, as I said, so Vietnam still requires the foreign military vessel to make a prior notification, and this one is challenged by the U.S. And if you can see from the press review, the press of the Second Fleet, it's clearly stated here that this FONOPS in the last March this year, so they conduct it to challenge the restriction on innocent passage posed by China, Taiwan, and Vietnam. And the second maritime claim made by Vietnam challenged by the US is actually related to the Vietnam's baseline. So I think I have a map here. Yeah. So here you can see the red dot here is Con Đảo Islands. And the Con Đảo Island used by Vietnam to make it as a base point, which the US argues that it is considerably at the considerable distance from the Vietnam's mainland, and this island is not close enough to be considered as the baseline for Vietnam's territorial water. And in 2020, US conducted a FONOPS in the vicinity of the Con Đảo Island to challenge this claimed by Vietnam. Right. That is from the legal aspect. So the position of Vietnam on the freedom of navigation is reflected in a number of the Vietnamese official statements. For instance, the ambassador of Vietnam the Ambassador Đặng Hoàng Giang, and he is the permanent representative of Vietnam to the United Nations. He affirmed the necessity for maintaining peace, security, and freedom of navigation and overflight in the East Sea while he attended the 32nd meeting of the states parties to the UN Clause 1982. And the position of Vietnam on the freedom of navigation is also repeated in various statements made by the Vietnamese Ministry of Foreign Affairs. I just want to read a little bit on this because there's a little bit a subtle differences if you look closely in each statement by the Vietnam. So in order, when being asked about Vietnam's response to the UN FONOPS, through when the FONOPS, which conducted through the territorial of some high tide features in Spratly Islands in 2015 and 2016. So what is Vietnam in the statement has said that the spokesperson of the Vietnamese Foreign Affairs has said that Vietnam respects the right of innocent passage in the territorial sea in accordance with the relevant rules of international law, and particularly the UN Clause. In 2017, after the US intended to conduct another FONOPS, then Vietnam assert that this is a little bit different. They assert that the Vietnam respects the rights of every nation to conduct its rights to freedom of navigation and overflight in accordance with international law. And in 2019, Vietnam stated that besides reaffirm the respect to the freedom of navigation, Vietnam also added that Vietnam hopes all countries will continue contributing positively to maintaining the peace and stability on the basis of international law and the East Sea. So, at this point, if you already forgot what I have mentioned before, that's okay, no worries. But I would be very happy if you can take away some of the main points, which also the arguments that I want to make through my study and the talk today is that I agree with one US scholar when she said that it's really tempting, it really is tempting to describe the dispute between China and the US over the issue of freedom of navigation as a matter of competing interpretation of UN clause. But my study and my talk today is trying to argue, or at least give a more comprehensive view about this dispute, is that underlying the dispute over legal issues and interpretation, there are actually a various and mingled aspects. Every country turns to freedom of navigation as a tool to serve their legal, geopolitical, and strategic interests. For the US, given China's rise and the growing assertiveness in the South China Sea, the US turned to freedom of navigation as a tool to prevent China's maritime claims being accepted, to assure its allies and partners of the US commitment to the region, and most importantly is to justify and maintain its continued military presence in the region in the context of the strategic part of comprehensive with China is growing and more intense. For China, protesting military activities within its maritime zone actually is a matter of China's security, military expansion, and power projection into the Pacific. And once China has enough power and strong navy, they will begin actually exercise the same activities of freedom of navigation in other countries' exclusive economic zone. So freedom of navigation from my understanding to China is that it's a part of its contestation for a more favorable maritime order to serve its ultimate goal of building a maritime power. And for the small countries, in this case like Vietnam, it has had and it will pursue the approach of making the best use of the small country's tool, that is international law, in order to serve its national interest. And freedom of navigation is an important part of that international law tool as well as political tools. But the thing is, the difficulties for the small countries is that they have to work really hard to find ways to walk into a very thin line to maintain their freedom to navigate through this troubled period of intense great power strategic competition in the region of the South China Sea. And with that point, I think I will stop my talk today and now looking forward to all of your comments and feedback. Thank you.
Okay. Okay, thank you. Lan Ying gave us a wonderful and a great speech around the South China Sea. And South China Sea is very important issue, not only around the Taiwan, Vietnam, China, even the whole of the world, because South China Sea issue related so-called United States and China strategic competition. So that means South China Sea issue worth everyone to know that and to understand that. And thank you. Lan Ying gave us a wonderful speech. Let us to know about the freedom of navigation around the United States and China, especially come from so-called Vietnamese perspective. So, do you have any question to ask our today's teacher?
I just hope that they
Do you have any special questions, especially from the Vietnamese government? Could you come here because I hope very yes yes you can.
Okay, thank you.
That's okay, yes.
For this one, I think is like a sensitive matter, so, and quite a bit complicated because it's on the term on the scale of like international. So I think for this one, like question, I think it's a bit hard to make because like I'm just a student. So okay, so do you think like on the government for the government like on the political, is there anything else they can do instead of just like arguing over with other world leader, or maybe anything making from Vietnam's perspective we can make some pressure on other country? Okay, I think that's my question.
That's great.
Thank you.
So I want to paraphrase your question is exactly what is Vietnam should do more in the case of the South China Sea. Well, I think that's a very good question, and I mean I'm a researcher. This question actually we can ask a lot of other institutes in Vietnam, especially the decision maker. But from the perspective of a researcher, I think there's a lot of things that we actually has done very well and can do more The first one, I mean, at the moment, I mean, from the perspective of research, then Vietnamese, like the DIAB, the diplomatic of the academy, they have do a very great work when they try to combine all the researchers in scholars, international scholars in the world, and they attend the annual conference on the South China Sea every year. And this is really great because, I mean, the Vietnamese diplomacy is based on what we call like the people, using the people and the like we call it. So we have diplomacy, we have two tracks. The track one is official track with the governmental officials. The second track is like people to people. But we have 1.5 tracks in which that we combine the government and the researchers together. So that I think at the moment the DRC conferences on the South China Sea is really great for two reasons. The first one is at least we can through the conferences to make the international community understand at least the Vietnamese perspective, but also make other countries understand and have more attention to the issue of South China Sea. The second interest in that is that actually in the diplomatic you have so very various way of channels in order to get the support from the international community for the Vietnam's position. So the first channel is through the scholar conferences, and that's what Vietnam, from my personal point, is really great. But whatever we talk, actually, we must be backed with the real power. I do not say that Vietnam must have the strong, really strong military power. That is not feasible for small countries like Vietnam, because we have limited resources, which we really need to use to focus on economic development. But another part of that is we really need to improve our or modernize our military forces, especially the navals as well as the air forces, in that we can protect or at least threat to cause a certain kind of cost of deterrence, in that we can protect what really belongs to Earth according to the international law. So at least for the moment, I think there are two things that we can do more, or we should continue do, is through the conference and try to have a enough deterrent capabilities, at least to protect the Vietnam's desert under the international law is lawful have. So yes, that's how I will answer your question.
Thank you. Your answer due to our equipment.
So
And,
yes. Hello, professor.
No, I'm not yet. I'm not yet.
For me, it's like your speech is very clearly and then completely, and then so I now have question for you, and then it's big knowledge for me from the professor. So from this speech,
Yes.
so I know little about the
You
US
can talk
and
about your country.
US,
Indonesia.
China, and US and China have the freedom.
Freedom navigation.
Yeah, the freedom navigation. Because like for Indonesia, we also have like problem about the maybe with the Malaysia.
Yes.
And then just for me, it's like the speed is very absolutely, and then like it's great, prof. Thank you.
Okay.
That's great.
Okay. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. And I want to ask just one question. Do you have been to People's Republic of China to visit some scholarship or visiting some scholarship from the mainland China? And do you have any exchange with those Chinese friends? Talk about the South China Sea issue. How about your feeling or your thinking? Could you share with, that means Vietnamese friends and Chinese friends, how about your talking about South China Sea issue? Yes.
Your question is a difficult one, you know. Actually, that is what I myself do think is the limit of myself, because I am trained totally in the Western way. So my master, which is on the conflict management and resolution, is trained in the UK, and then my PhD I was trained in Germany. So the thing is, most of the time is my way of thinking and my network is more like Western way. And then because actually also the limit of my language, because my Chinese is not that good enough. But I do have some exchanges with some Chinese scholars. But I have to say those scholars that I have exchanged, they are trained in Western countries too. So some is my friend, my PhD friend. But and so I think I will divide it into two kind of exchange that I have the interaction with the Chinese scholars. One is those trained in the Western country where I am like we are friends and we talk like very in a informal way about the issues. And I think, yeah, maybe because they are also outside China, so their way of thinking is a little bit open in the issue of South China Sea. And actually, I have to say, in some extent, I'm quite like surprised by the way that they think about this issue. They are not so like aggressive in the way that they have to defend their sovereignty or the kind of the claims, but at least they will use the how to say the, because those friends they study the international law, so they will use the international law in some aspect of the Western way to explain about it, though they still have some reservation about whether it is like valid for China to have that kind of claim in the South China Sea. So, which means that in some extent they will combine all their national interests plus with the international law to explain about this situation from the perspective of legal aspect. And the second one is the Chinese scholars that I interact actually from the official conference that we held in our institute. And in that sense, I mean, we have quite a friendly conversation because it's a formal conversation. So each side will try to raise their position and make the other side understand the position that they are held. So I mean, in that sense, at least it's a very good source in order to see what is the position, what is to some extent, just to some extent, what is actually the red line in their position when they take that, and the argument in which that they will use to defend it. So, and from the Vietnamese side, we also try to explain as hard as possible the position of Vietnam too. So I mean that there's two channels and two interaction that in which that I have with the different trained Chinese scholars to date. Yeah, so that's what I wanted to share with you.
Okay, thank you. Sorry, thank you for your sharing, because we have two computer have some conflict about the voice. So thank you so much. And I need to end my class. And today we are so appreciate for your sharing your study and your speech, and let us learn from you very much. And if we have any opportunity, maybe we can see around the Taipei.
Sure.
Of course, we can continue to keep in touch.
Yes.
Okay, today we are so.
I want to say just a quick thank you so much for your patience and your invitation. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you so much. See you. Thank you.
See you.
See you. Bye.
Bye.
Bye. See you. Thank you. Okay, we will. Sorry. Wait a minute.